Christina piercings, also known as Venus piercings. We're going to talk about pros and cons of that piercing. We're also going to talk about the piercing procedure, what you should know beforehand, what it's like killing one, living with one, what type of jewelry, and what happens if you say, hey, I don't want this anymore. Please take it out. Coming up next on Pros and Cons by Piercer, Season 2, Episode number 50. So you should probably stick around. For those who are new to the channel, welcome to the Body Piercing and Tattooing channel. But you may not know who I am. My name is DaVo. I am a professional piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing Studio, located inside Skin Kitchen here in Des Moines, Iowa. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a female genital piercing. I always like to give a little bit of a disclaimer. If you do not want to hear about female genital piercings or sexual piercings in any way, shape, or form, or you're not of a proper age, or you're easily offended when people talk about such things, this isn't the video for you. I would suggest finding another video. There are plenty on this channel that have nothing to do with genitalia or anything sexual. Also, if you're looking for some kind of sexual stimulation, you're going to be sadly disappointed. This is not a video that you're going to get anything from. This is solely for educational purposes for those considering getting this piercing done. So you might want to look elsewhere. Well, let's talk about what a Christina piercing is. A Christina piercing, or also known as a Venus piercing or a Venus mom's piercing, is at the top of the vulva. It took me a second to remember what that's called. Where the outer labias or labia majoras, not menoras, majoras meet, done vertically through that area. This is a very... You really, really need to have the right anatomy to pull this piercing off. It is kind of on that vague kind of possibly a surface-to-surface piercing to it's kind of like a navel piercing. So you really do need to have the correct anatomy for this particular piercing. As far as the history of this piercing, it's a modern invention. It was developed in the 1990s. The name supposedly comes from, as legend will tell it, the first person to get one of these was named Christina. So thus... the piercing was named after them. Now let's move on to why you came here, or one of the many reasons. The pros, the advantages, the things that make you go, yeah, you know what? I need this in my life. Starting with number one, it looks beautiful. It is one of those piercings that the location, it just kind of draws the area and kind of just beautifies it. It adds to it. Now, number two. Long history of healing. This is not a new piercing. This is not experimental. It does have its issues with rejection of migration and other things we'll get into a little bit later when we get to the cons, but it can heal. It is not unusual for these to heal fairly rapidly and stay there for a very, very long time. Number three, can be done in groupings. This piercing can be grouped with other either female genital piercings or a navel. Like a real common one is to kind of get that center line, get the navel done, this Christina, and then the vertical clitoral hood. So there's kind of this line of little gem settings that kind of offset and draw attention to the area. Number four, because the location is so high on the genitalia, it doesn't interrupt intercourse as much as other piercings would or possibly would. This doesn't kind of doesn't really mess with fun time as much. Of course, precautions and avoiding the area is a good idea. And the last one, number five, easy to conceal. If you work in a profession where you're not allowed to have visible piercings, or a conservative part of the world, or just have a conservative family or what have you, where piercings would be not a good thing in your life that people knew you had them, this is a piercing that you can get. Nobody needs to know you have it. Nobody needs to know unless you want them to. Before we move on to the cons and disadvantages, first off, I want to remind you, if you like this, please give us a thumbs up. Share with other people because sharing is caring. If you'd like to see more of these, please subscribe, hit that notification bell so that you're notified every single time we post something. If you have a question or you'd like to add to the conversation, please leave a comment. Now it's time for the cons. The disadvantages, the things that make you go, no, I don't want that. I do not need that in my life. Please, let's move along to something else. Starting with number 1, you really have to have the proper anatomy. This is a piercing. I know some people that have watched other videos that I've done on female genitalia. There's kind of 2 extremes when it comes to female genitalia. There's the hill and the valley. The hill, most of that outer or inner labia or labia minora, maybe even the clitoral hood and the clitoris are all very visible outside the body and almost in a hill or a mountain. The valley, everything is kind of concealed. With this, because we need that natural ridge there, that almost navel-like area or shape, it really needs to be somebody that is more in the valley side than in the hillside. Everybody's in between the 2 extremes, and everybody's uniquely different. Yes, you are. That's why that doesn't look like that when you look at that on other people. This one, you really need to have that tissue there to support it and keep it somewhat protected, or otherwise it's basically just a surface-to-surface piercing, and chances are it will reject. Number 2, STDs. Because it's a genital piercing, you are more susceptible to STDs even after the piercing heals, so you need to practice safe sex, which means latex barrier, whenever switching partners. Number 3, kind of talked a little bit about this before, but this piercing is often prone to migration or rejection. If you don't have the anatomy or this isn't done correctly, it can reject or migrate out of the body. You really have to be, the placement has to be right, the jewelry has to be right, and you have to have that right anatomy. Number 4, this thing can swell. And often it's really hard to determine exactly how much swelling you're going to see. And it creates kind of that perfect storm we sometimes see in cartilage piercings where if the post isn't long enough to allow for that swelling, it just begins to swell beyond it, and the swelling will not go away until that bar is lengthened. It is definitely a piercing that you really need to be pierced sometimes a little bit on the big side just to be on the safe side. Which will require downsizing and additional jewelry investment later on down the road. But the swelling can be very uncomfortable. It can cause it to nest or impact. Lots of different issues, mainly because the tissue is so soft there. And the last one, number 5, can catch on clothing. If you think about where it's located at and removing your trousers or undergarments, I think it's safe to understand why this could be an issue. It's right there, depending on the end that's on it, depending on the length of the post and where it's positioned, it can constantly get caught on clothing. So it's really something that can be a problem depending on what you wear, your body type, shape, etc. Before we move on to things you should consider, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. Lots of t-shirts, lots of swag, lots of panty packs, stickers, all kinds of fun stuff from ages 12 and up. Now let's move on to things you should look for. Piercers should be experienced with this piercing, and you should verify that. They should have either photos of doing these piercings they've done in the past, or if you know somebody that has a piercing, talk to them about what their experience was like. Research a piercer is what I'm getting at, kids. The piercer should be professional, informative, and make you feel comfortable. Keep in mind, you're going to disrobe in front of this person, so it needs to be somebody that is going to make you feel comfortable in that situation. The piercer, without being asked, should offer a consultation. This should involve risks, what it's going to take to heal it, lifestyle changes, clothing changes, and also they should evaluate your anatomy and see whether or not this piercing is right for you. One thing I always tell people when they're getting these piercings that are very dependent on your anatomy is always have a backup plan. Let's say you're coming in to get a Christina because that's what you really want, but you're also considering, let's say, a navel piercing or an outer labia or a clitoral hood piercing. So kind of always have that backup plan when you come in just to be on the safe side, especially if you definitely want to get pierced that day. I've already kind of covered this, but the piercer should evaluate your anatomy and check it to make sure that it is going to be compatible with this piercing. This one, you just have it or you don't. Usually this piercing is done with 1 or 2 types of jewelry, either a curved barbell or an L-shaped barbell, often called a half surface bar. It's kind of like a surface bar on one side, and the other side is just a straight barbell. Either of those are acceptable. I haven't done much with the L-bins or L-bit bars or the half-cert, whatever you want to call it. We usually use a curved barbell. It seems to work pretty well. I can see the advantage of the other type depending on the anatomy, especially if the piercing is going to end up being very shallow. And in that case, it may be best not to pierce it because it's probably going to be more like a surface-to-surface piercing than an actual Christina piercing. Next thing is you're going to be disrobing. So wear clothing that you're comfortable removing easily, etc. For example, wear a skirt or a dress, maybe some underwear that you don't care about getting stained. Something's comfortable, something that's easy to remove. Leggings are great with this too. And something that's going to be loose-fitting and away from the piercing initially is usually a good idea too. Lastly, does your piercer supply aftercare product or at least sell it for you? If they don't, contact them ahead of time and find out where you need to go to purchase that so you can have it on hand and not be running around with a fresh piercing trying to find stuff. Now let's move on to the piercing experience. First thing that's going to happen is you're going to have a consultation. Most of this is verbal. They'll cover things like risks, what it's going to take to heal it, etc. That's all usually covered in that consultation. Also, they're going to probably ask you to come back into a private area and do an examination of your anatomy to see if you're suitable for this piercing. Next, you're going to pick out the jewelry. Piercer is going to probably come up with a size that's going to work best for you, and this might involve measuring the area too while they're evaluating your anatomy. And then you might get some different choices, like it could be a different color if they anodize jewelry or a different end, etc. Next up, you fill out a waiver. Piercer sets up all his instruments, tools, and etc. And then disinfects the area. Next, they'll mark it. Usually put you in a reclined position. That's personally the way I like to do it. This piercing is done usually freehand. I have heard of people using forceps, but I have to say that is just going to add a ton more pain to the experience. It's just not a space usually where those clamps are going to fit comfortably. So usually it's the needle is injected in and through and into a needle receiving tube. Very quick. You might most genital piercing is kind of an "ow God, that hurts" and it's over. But I've heard from a number of clients this one, it's an "oh God, that hurts" and then a throbbing and aching immediately after. Unlike a majority of other genital piercings. I think it's partly because it's kind of right there at that borderline where the genitalia kind of ends and your pubic area begins. Usually a guide pin is used to insert the jewelry, usually a threaded one that's attached. Once that's in there, the jewelry guide pin's taken off. Jewelry end's attached. Any bleeding that's occurred is cleaned up, usually with a piece of gauze and some lovely cold sterile saline spray, which feels good, very good, right after a piercing. Now, you might notice some moderate to light to heavy. It varies from person to person bleeding. One thing I forgot to mention with things you should consider, you might want to bring along pads, especially if you have a type that you like best. Otherwise, we generally will give you a piece of sterile gauze with some saline on it to put against the area, just in case it bleeds, and before you can get home. When you do get home, if they are using gauze, make sure that falls off on its own. If it doesn't want to, saturate the area either with saline or running water, and it should fall off on its own. Like all piercings, this one will be tender to the touch. Clothing, loose fitting, having a day just to kind of relax and not have a lot of activities going on is usually a good idea. Like, for example, if you have a 3-day weekend, do this on Friday after work so you have that whole weekend to kind of just sit around the house in some sweatpants or comfy pants and just relax. Let's go into healing. This will take on average a healing time of anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks. I usually suggest with genital piercings, you treat them like a healing piercing for a minimum of 3 months. That's going to involve cleaning twice a day using a sterile saline. Personally, I like Nelman's Piercing Aftercare. You just missed it on there. You can also find the wound wash version, but it may require you doing a compress or finding another way to apply it to the actual piercing. Biggest thing other than that is practicing cross-contamination prevention. That's going to include washing your hands before you handle it, no oral contact or exchanging of bodily fluids on, near, or around the piercing until it's healed. As I mentioned earlier, you are more acceptable STDs even after the piercing is healed, so switch partners, practice safe sex. If you're with the same partner, it shouldn't be an issue as long as the piercing is healed. During the healing process, though, I do suggest using some type of latex barrier and avoiding contact with that particular piercing as much as possible. Keep your environment clean. Clothing, bedding, towels, anything that may come in contact with it. Do not submerge the piercing in bodies of water you cannot control the quality of, which is pretty much everything but your own clean bathtub, until the piercing is healed. Keep pets away from it. Don't let them sleep in the bed with you. We're not really worried. I mean, everybody kind of laughs when I say that when it comes to these genital piercings and et cetera. We're more concerned about the pet transferring contaminants into your bedding and then it getting into the wound and causing an infection. Of course, we know you're not going to have your pet having contact with that area. Ugh. Anyway, now, this piercing can swell a lot with certain individuals, and it creates that perfect storm I talked a little bit about earlier, where it swells beyond the length of the jewelry, and that agitates it so it swells more, and then really the only way to solve it is to put in a longer post. Keep an eye on it. If it starts exceeding it or it feels like the balls are starting to impact into the piercing, you need a longer barbell, and you probably need different ends. I found the disc style or the flat backed, like bezeled jewelry, etc., that has a flat back to it opposed to the balls, tend to be less likely to cause these issues. Also, a slightly wider one. I wouldn't put something that has really small ends on it because they were going to be more likely to sink into that soft tissue. Sexual activity whenever you're comfortable. Gentle at first. Try to avoid the area. If it hurts to do something, stop doing it. Do something else or rest. Just listen to your body, basically. Avoid clothing that is going to catch on the jewelry easily. For example, if you're wearing underwear that is really lacy or like a fishnet tights or something like that, probably not your best option if it's going to constantly be catching on that jewelry. The other thing is if you have a loofah and you use it on a regular basis, say goodbye to it. Throw it away and don't buy another one. They will catch on this really bad too. Overall, avoid contact and trauma with the area. Loose-fitting clothing is always a good idea. Sometimes having really tight jeans on, if they have a really thick seam, can be very uncomfortable. Just listen to your body. If it hurts to wear something, you probably shouldn't be wearing it. Now, for the first 3 to 5 days, it's not uncommon to see a little bit of bleeding, and anything from slight to moderate. It may require you to wear a pad, sanitary napkin in the area. That's going to do a couple different things. It's also going to cut down not only on bleeding, but cut down the amount of moisture in the area, which cuts down the amount of bacteria, and it also has a little bit of cushioning during that period of time. Normal reactions, like with any piercings, is redness, discolorization, heat, tenderness to touch, inflammation, off and on, anywhere from 3 to 5 days. After that, you're going to see discharge off and on throughout the healing period. Usually, the crusties, usually this kind of collects around the area. Don't get in there and dig around with it. Do not spin it. Do not rotate it. Do not move it. Leave it alone. If the discharge is really heavy, see your piercer or try rinsing it under warm water once a day in the shower at the end of your shower, and that usually will help remove it between that and the saline solution. Now let's talk about jewelry options. You can change the jewelry after the piercing is healed. If you had to put in a longer post to allow for swelling and it's overly long, usually anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks into the healing process, it's not an issue to go in there and change it to a shorter and downsize the length of it. I do suggest you have that done by a piercer. Don't try to do it at home unless you have the proper tools to do it, including a guide pin and possibly a nice set of hemostats that are both sterile. Jewelry-wise, commonly these are 14 gauge or thicker, usually anywhere from 3/8 of an inch all the way up to 9/16. It depends on your anatomy, what's going to work best, and also what the placement of the piercing is going to be. Whenever you're thinking about changing jewelry and you're unsure about the size, always see your piercer. Have them size it for you. They're going to have a little bit more expertise on what's going to work or not. Usually, like any piercing that's in an area of the body that there's possibly a little bit of expansion here and there, it's usually best to have something that's a little bit loose-fitting, like maybe a 1/16 of an inch too long. As far as jewelry style, curved barbells are your best bet, or the L-shaped barbells, or the half surface bars, or Christina bars. They've been called various different things. Usually on the bottom of that, you want a fairly small end, something that's not really huge, that's going to fit in there comfortably and not agitate anything. A lot of my female clients have found the discs really comfortable in there. Others say that's uncomfortable, so kind of experiment and see what works best for you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, having a flat back to that end or a disc is going to reduce that likelihood of nesting where the body kind of the balls kind of sink in. Having that flat surface and having it wide enough will reduce that likelihood, and will also, on a piercing where you've already had that problem because both ends were balls, usually if you wear that jewelry with the flat back that it's wide enough to cover up that hole, it'll usually start filling that area back in. Now, the jewelry can be either threaded or threadless. The thing with threadless, you have to be a little more cautious and make sure you're not catching on things. Bigger ends is possible, too, if you want something really fancy, like a nice cluster bead or something like that. They look really cool there, to be honest with you. They just kind of float there, so it looks like you have an extra little gem there. That's okay. You just want to make sure that you're cautious when you're changing clothing and taking down clothing and et cetera. Just be aware that it's there, because with the threadless, oftentimes just the right amount of force can cause them to come out. Sometimes even spinning them in a curved barbell can cause them to suddenly loosen up and fall out. So do check them. Of course, check the tightness of the balls if they're threaded jewelry on a regular basis. Now let's talk about living with the piercing. Jewelry, keep it in at all times. Your best option, closing this piercing, because it's a fairly long piercing and where it's located at, it's not probably going to stay. It's probably going to begin to close almost immediately. That inside tunnel is going to shrink shut, and you're not going to be able to get something back in it. It's always best to have something in the piercing. Always avoid pressure and trauma to the area, even after it's healed, especially if you're wearing jewelry that has like a larger end on it. Clean the jewelry in the shower using warm soap and water. Perfectly fine. Just to keep, your general stuff off of it, including sebums. Always avoid clothing that might get caught on it, even after it heals. Check the ends on a regular basis. That's pretty much the biggest parts of living with it. This piercing doesn't really affect sexual activity as much, but it depends on what you're doing and what position you're in. Do keep that in mind. Just be cautious. Now, lastly, abandoning the piercing. Let's say you decide you don't want it anymore. If it's still healing and there is any sign of problem, if there's redness, discolorization, if it looks like it might be infected or some other problem, see a professional, a medical professional, or your piercer before removing the jewelry. There's always a possibility that if you do have an infection and that infection is deep inside the piercing and you remove that jewelry before it's healed, that infection can get trapped in there. So the way your body heals infections is it isolates the tissue, the affected tissue and fluids, and then slowly pushes it out of the body, usually through the wound. If the piercing holes close on both sides, which is commonly will happen during the healing process, a healed piercing usually not, but when it's still healing, those holes are usually the first thing that closes. It can trap it in there, which could create an abscess or a cyst and then require medical treatment. So if there's a problem, see your piercer or a doctor before taking the jewelry out. If it's healing and it's perfectly healthy and there's no signs of problems, it's not going to be a problem to remove the jewelry. It'll probably close fairly quickly if it's still healing. If the piercing is healed, removing the jewelry shouldn't cause any problems as long as there's no sign of issues. What will generally happen is your body will squeeze that tunnel together, that tube, and then slowly begin to fill it up. You're going to be left with some indentation scars, etc. Occasionally, that will secrete this kind of smelly stuff that has a consistency of cream cheese. I always want to say cottage cheese. I don't know why, but cream cheese, waxy kind of oil. That's sebums. It's normal. It's natural. It doesn't mean you have an infection or there's stuff in there. Just cleaning it with warm water and soap is perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. Well, that's all I have to say on Christina piercings or Venus piercings. Till next time, here's hoping all your piercings heal with ease and without a single issue. And if you're in the Des Moines, Iowa area, I hope to see you for body piercing needs in the future. Have a good day, everybody. Take care, and check out one of these other videos.